Hey everybody, this is Alice of Alice Arlene, and this is the first session for my Intro to Mixed Media class. So wanted to start with the surface that you're going to be using to paint on. If you went to my website, alicearlene.com, and got the supply list for signing up for my newsletter, then you'll note that I recommend either watercolor paper, which this is 140-pound watercolor paper, or 300-pound watercolor paper, which you can kind of see is a lot thicker and stiffer. I'll be using the 140-pound watercolor paper because that's sufficient and a lot less expensive. So, or a hardboard panel. So this evening I'm going to be showing you how to prepare your surface for painting. I mentioned in one of the earlier periscopes about the supplies that I would show you how to kind of fake the Deckle Edge. You'll notice on, hopefully y'all can see this, the edge, this is what's called the Deckle Edge. It's handmade paper, and so this is the natural edge that the paper has when it comes out of the mold. So, and this is both, this is the original corner, and you can see here, this is 1/4 of a sheet of watercolor paper. So, which usually it's, I think, 22 by 30 if I'm remembering correctly. Somewhere thereabouts anyway. So on these two, I've torn the paper so that it resembles, it's not an alarmingly harsh line in contrast to the lovely Deckle Edge. So which, if you're going to mat it and frame it, it doesn't really matter. But sometimes it's fun to float the piece on top of the mat. So then you would want to maintain a nice Deckle Edge. So to do that, you want a nice sturdy ruler, and obviously long enough for whichever direction you're going to cut it. I'm gonna be working on about 8 by 10 size, which this won't be exactly because I'm just gonna cut it in half. So I'm gonna make a mark. This is a little over 15. So at 7.5, I'm gonna make a slight penciled mark there, and do the same thing here. So, and then I place my ruler, and it does matter which way you tear it, which way the Deckle Edge goes. So it's kind of worthwhile paying attention to that if you want to, experimenting with your paper. They're all a little bit different, but pretty much similar. So I'm going to hold down very firmly, and then I'm going to begin to tear. So, but I'm pressing very firmly and tearing, so you can see that this is, see, this edge is a little bit more deckly looking than this one. So if I flip it over, it looks a little bit rougher. So, but anyway, that's how you maintain or gain a Deckle Edge. So some of your papers are man-made, and so they will have a harsh edge all the way around. If you prefer the Deckle look, then you could do the same thing, just tear off a small strip of around the edge. So I'm going to set one of those aside. The watercolor paper is very absorbent, which that's what you need when you're doing watercolor paper. There are two ways that you can seal the surface so that it's not going to absorb a ton of paint when you first get started. The first is with your matte medium. So, and if you remember, I use the Liquitex brand. It doesn't really matter, but this is more your liquid, you can hear it sloshing, medium, not your gel or thick pasty medium. And I have put it in this little, hopefully I can get the lid off. It leaked on me the other day, and here we go. I did a demonstration in town, and for some reason my little, whoops, container is not super happy about that, So what I've done here is I've diluted this matte medium about half and half. It doesn't have to be exact, but so that it's about the consistency of light cream or half and half, somewhere in there. And so I'm just going to liberally coat, and you'll want to use your largest brush for this. I couldn't find mine. So, and you're just gonna paint the matte medium all over your surface. If you do happen to leave some areas, which I generally tend to, then those will of course absorb the paint more. But as long as it's not the whole thing, then it's not as problematic. So anyway, so you'll set that aside to dry. And like I said, it'll probably take, but I mean, obviously it depends on the humidity and that type of thing in your place, how fast it takes to dry. But so then this is a hardboard panel that I've cut myself. You can purchase hardboard panels at an art supply store. Typically they're already pre-primed. So if you're going to do that, then none of this applies to you at all. However, if you're wanting to save some money and do things a little bit less expensively, you can purchase the hardboard in the paneling section at your hardware store. So this is 1/8 of an inch thick. It also comes in 1/4 of an inch thick, which if you're going to work very large, you would probably want to go with the thicker. Usually I do when I get up to like 2 feet and that sort of thing, because it's sturdier. So, but it's nice. It's not flexible at all, and it's a nice smooth surface. Some people also paint on plywood, which would be fine as well, so far as I know. The texture of the wood kind of shows through the first few layers, but if you're going to build up a lot of layers like I usually do, it doesn't matter. So this is evidently the factory edge here, and you can see when it gets cut, a lot of times, hopefully you can see, that it's a little bit rough there on the underside, or whichever side they cut. The saw makes one side rougher than the other. So I'm going to take just a little piece of 60 grit sandpaper, and I'm just going to lightly sand. And typically I do this over my trash can so that I don't get all the little sandy bits in all my paintings. So I'm just going to lightly sand the edges so that way, when the board is new, they don't feel rough, but once you get a lot of the paint and that type of stuff and it starts to dry, it can be quite sharp. So I've given myself paper cuts before, so I don't recommend doing them. So here you have it's sanded. And then for these, which you can also use, this is gesso, just plain whatever you find, gesso. As I said, I'm not picky about my gesso. The cheaper the better. So I'm just going to glob some gesso on. And again, you can use gesso on the watercolor paper as well. There's a couple of artists that do that. So you can either spread it with a brush, or I've recently learned that you can use a credit card or that type of thing to spread it around at first. So, and then if you like that texture and you want to maintain that, then you can certainly leave it. The thicker the texture, obviously it's going to take longer to dry, but generally by the time, overnight or whatever, it's going to be fine. So I'm going to just do that and then carry on with just again another large brush. So if I'm working on very large pieces, then I've purchased just a house painting brush, so because they're quite large. So I go back and forth, and then depending on your gesso and how thick you get it and all of that, it really depends on if you need to make another coat or whatever, if you want it to be a perfectly pure white surface. So again, with my technique being so kind of erratic, I guess, at the beginning, I'm not all that concerned about having a perfectly flat or a perfectly covered surface. So if you can see that there's kind of some ridges and that kind of things. And for some reason, I've never had any gesso that doesn't do this. There tends to be like little slubs. There's little kind of, I guess, balls of gesso. I don't know what it is. So I don't, unless they're very large and distracting, I tend to leave them. But if it is distracting for you, then you can take just a sheet of 220 paper, or I would use a much smaller piece than this, and then just lightly go over the whole surface. So, and some people prefer to do that just generally. So I haven't really noticed with the gesso that I use that it makes a big difference. But anyway, that's how you're going to prepare your surfaces for this technique. So here's your, again, just a brief review. Here is your hardboard panel that you can get in 4x8 sheets at the hardware store, and they will cut it for you, depending on how many cuts. Just got some of my sanding dust on my watercolor paper. So depending on what size you want, they might charge you for, you know, if you're getting a lot of cuts, because obviously you're cutting quite a bit. Or you can cut them yourself or whatever. And then also 140-pound watercolor paper that I've coated with matte medium, a mixture of 50-50 matte medium and water. And this one is coated with gesso. So let me see. I don't know if any of y'all have any questions. But you can feel free to find me on Facebook and ask those questions there at Alice Arlene. And then I'll be doing these each night, and I'll try and let you know on Facebook what approximate time each evening that I'll be doing each subsequent lesson. So hope you're having a great day. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.